recently, the wonderful Intraspecies came over to my channel to respond to a carnivore apparent PhD. It was a really good time, but I think that the video that she's actually got on her channel is probably a better representation. There are notes and annotations down in the description, and there'll probably be some in the comments as well, so please do check those out. And please check out Intraspecies if you haven't already.
Hello everyone. Just as a preface, I'm going to be covering empirical topics in this, and for some it may feel like I'm over-explaining things. I'd like to make it clear that this is intentional because there are varying levels of familiarity with these topics among my audience members. As such, I did my best to ensure that even those with no experience reading or talking about what I cover can still understand and follow along with what I say. Of course, if I'm made aware that anything I say in this video is wrong, it will be noted in the pinned comment and description. I recently did a video with Vegan Gaze where I hopped on her live stream and responded to a carnivore doctor's video on how veganism is responsible for more animal deaths than rangeland beef. I wanted to do my own dedicated video to this, both so that the information can reach a wider audience and also so I can script it and have a bit more control over the wording and organization than is possible within a live stream. Pretty much everything I discuss in this video was also discussed in Ellie's video, so if you've already seen that, then you're going to have a serious case of deja vu watching this. Although in this instance, I do explain some things that other laymen may have found confusing. I employed the help of a number of people for this, so be sure to check the description for the names of all the smart people I've learned from, so you can learn from them too. At the start of the video, Dr. Zaldivar states,
"This movement is based on the false assumption that eating a vegan diet causes no loss of sentient or emotion-feeling animal life."
This, in my opinion, is a massive straw man. Vegans largely don't reject the existence of crop deaths. Their response to this objection will certainly vary, and different responses fall subject to different criticisms. But that does not negate the fact that Dr. Zaldivar is strawmanning us here. If I'm being charitable, she might think this because vegans do have a tendency of saying, "I'm vegan because I don't like causing harm to or killing animals," but A, this is often a very short answer devoid of the nuance of that vegan's position and intended to just generally communicate their values, and B, does not get you to the conclusion that they reject the existence of crop deaths. About 30 seconds into the video, Dr. Zaldivar cites the Mike Archer paper on crop deaths as evidence that we kill 25 times more animals than those who eat rangeland beef.
Producing wheat and other grains to service a vegetarian or vegan diet results in at least 25 times more sentient animals being killed per kilogram of usable protein, more environmental damage, and a great deal more animal cruelty.
However, this paper has a few issues with it. One, the figure overestimates the number of deaths associated with mice plagues, presumably because Archer misinterpreted his sources. Two, it neglects to consider that not all domestically produced grain within Australia is consumed by humans. And three, it does not consider the death toll of other animal products besides rangeland beef. There are other problems with this paper, and if you're interested in reading up on them, then I suggest joining Cogdis's Discord, where he discusses these issues. He's also the one who helped me with this, so big shout out to him. Let's go over the first issue I mentioned. How does Mike Archer get this number, and where did he go wrong? Well, if we look here, Archer appears to be saying that in a time span of 4 years, each area of the Australian grain belt will have experienced a plague at some point within that time span. And just to clarify, a plague occurs when mouse populations grow to an extent that becomes problematic for farmers. They consequently employ methods such as poison to kill them. So if, for example, the belt is divided up into areas A, B, C, and D, then from 2000 to 2004, a mouse plague will have at some points occurred in A, occurred in B, occurred in C, and also occurred in D, according to Archer. However, if we look at the areas in Archer's sources that mention mouse plagues occurring every 4 years, what they actually appear to be saying is that within a 4-year time span, there will have been a plague somewhere within the grain belt, not that each area had one. If we want to visualize what this looks like, in a time span of 4 years, plague will have occurred either in A, B, C, or D, but not necessarily in all of them. It is worth noting that one of his sources does identify plagues as increasing to about 1 every year or 2 within the last 20 years, so let's alleviate some of this confusion by delving into the actual numbers. According to CRC Australia, between 100,000 and 500,000 hectares of grain crops are subject to mouse infestations each year. Let's be charitable and assume this means that the entirety of these areas also experience a mouse plague each year, and use this to calculate the most charitable upper and lower bounds of death rates among mice according to Archer's references. Archer's range for the amount of mice killed during these plagues is at least 500 to 1,000. I don't know how he got these numbers, as his sources cite a range of 200 to 800 as constituting a minor plague and 800 plus as a major plague, but we'll nonetheless use 1,000 as the upper limit and 500 as the lower limit. Even if the numbers are higher than this, the criticisms covered later in the video would still be a significant blow to the claims being made here. Archer also claims that, at minimum, 80% of the mice are killed, giving us a range of 80 to 100% of mice killed during these plagues. I'm going to start getting into some math here, and we'll be using visuals to help clarify what I'm saying. So if you're listening while in a different tab, you might want to check the screen just for this portion. Here's what the formula we'll be using looks like, but I'll take you through it step by step. For the upper bounds calculation, we're going to multiply the maximum number of hectares by the maximum number of mice deaths to get the total amount of mice deaths occurring within 500,000 hectares of grain crops. We also want to multiply this by 1, which represents 100% of mice killed. After we do this, we will divide our result by 4,004,000. This is how many tons of grain protein exist in Australia. Here's where that number is coming from for anyone who's curious. We're doing this because Archer is looking at how many deaths occur per 100 kilogram of protein. Once we divide our result by 4,004,000, the number we're left with is how many mice deaths occur per 1 ton of grain protein. We want our answer to be per 100 kilograms, not per 1 ton. Thus, we divide our answer by 10. If you're confused about why we do that, there are 1,000 kilograms in 1 ton. Thus, when we look at how much something occurs per a single ton, this is the same as it occurring per 1,000 kilograms. But we want 100 kilograms, not 1,000. To get from 1,000 to 100, you just divide by 10. Thus, we took our initial answer from the equation, which is the amount of deaths per 1,000 kilograms or 1 ton, and divided it by 10 to get the answer in the form of per 100 kilograms. When we do this, we get a result of 12.5 animals killed per 100 kilograms of protein, which is 77% less than Archer's estimate. Now let's look at the lower bounds regarding how many mice are killed. This is pretty much the same process we just did. We're going to take the minimum amount of land now, 100,000 hectares, multiply it by the minimum amount of mice killed, 500. Once we do that, we want to take the answer we get and multiply it by 0.8. This is because we're assuming for the lower bound, only 80% of the mice are actually killed. Recall that Archer's estimate for what percentage of the mice are killed is 80 to 100%, and multiplying our number by 0.8, which is the decimal form of 80%, will tell us what 80% of that number is. Once we do that, we again want to divide our answer by 4,004,000, and then divide that answer by 10 to get a final figure of just under 1 mouse killed per 100 kilograms of grain protein. Thus, our range of mice killed per 100 kilograms of protein for grain is about 1 to 12.5. This is much different than Archer's figure of 55. Let's move on to the next criticism: grain and its use as animal feed. As Cogdis states, as per Archer's own source, 3.5 million tons of just wheat is used for animal feed. This is more than the 2.2 million tons domestically consumed directly by humans. Therefore, if we were to apply the wheat-related deaths fairly for domestic consumption directly versus animal feed, that would be approximately 54% of crop-related deaths that can be attributed to animal agriculture versus 35% for direct human consumption. How can this be possible if most rangeland cattle aren't eating it? Remember, there are other animals besides cattle within animal agriculture that are fed grain. Also, wheat is grown and exported to other countries where it may be used as animal feed there. In fact, livestock feed is consistently the overwhelming majority of overall domestic grain use. According to the Australian Feed Grain Supply and Demand Report of 2013 to 2014, total Australian domestic grain use is estimated to be 12.6 million tons. Animal feeding is by far the largest user at 8.8 million tons. That's over half. Additionally, Archer neglects to look at how many deaths other facets of animal agriculture are responsible for. For example, according to FAO data, in the year 2011, which is when this paper was published, over 504 million chickens were slaughtered in Australia. As of 2019, that number has increased to over 650 million. These numbers alone surpass the maximum number of mice calculated to have been killed in crop production, which is 500 million. Dr. Zaldivar recommends her audience watch Sacred Cow, a pro-animal agriculture documentary created by Diana Rodgers.
For more about this specific topic, I highly recommend you watch Sacred Cow documentary. I'll link it for you in the description box below.
Anyone who recommends Diana Rodgers as a reliable source of information should immediately have their commitment to scientific integrity called into question. Let's examine this by looking at a few of the claims she has made. One claim she's made is that there are 0 studies that demonstrate removing meat from the diet will improve health or growth. There are 2 interpretations of this. The first is that there are 0 studies showing that 100% elimination of meat from the diet is needed to improve health, or in other words, that there's no difference between 0.5% of your current individual consumption rate and 0%. But that's not a claim widely being made. And this is also true of other substances like cigarettes, meth, and cyanide. All of these things have a threshold of harm wherein you can safely consume some amount below that threshold. However, this isn't an argument in favor of the idea that we should consume that thing, or else again, we could apply it to things like hard drugs. The second interpretation of what she's saying is that there are 0 studies showing any reduction in meat improves health. Of course, this is just not true. There certainly are studies establishing this. For example, one paper by Larson and Orsini states, in a dose-response meta-analysis, consumption of processed meat and total red meat, but not unprocessed red meat, was statistically significantly positively associated with all-cause mortality in a nonlinear fashion. These results indicate that high consumption of red meat may increase all-cause mortality. It's also worth noting that she has used the weakest form of this argument. She didn't claim something like there were no methodologically sound studies establishing this. She simply claimed that there were no studies at all. The only thing needed to falsify this claim is to simply present any study that concludes reducing meat improved the health of the participants, regardless of whether that study was actually good or not. Another claim that Diana Rodgers has made is that there is no difference in all-cause mortality between vegetarians and omnivores when confounders are adjusted for. For those who may not know, ACM, or all-cause mortality, refers to death from any cause. Basically, you look at a given time frame and observe who died more. Confounders are things that can cause either the outcome or the thing we're hypothesizing actually causes the outcome, otherwise known as the exposure, but that the exposure itself does not cause. This sounds confusing at first, but let's look at an example. If people say veganism leads to depression, veganism would be the exposure, and depression would be the outcome. A confounder here might be intelligence. Intelligence can cause both veganism and depression, but is not caused by veganism or the exposure. Now, you can get nitpicky and start arguing that veganism encourages people to research more or whatever, but I'm just trying to keep things simple here. Anyway, let's look at the source Diana cited in support of her claim. This is the study she cites. And it's not true that they observed no difference, but rather no statistically significant difference. Something is considered statistically significant if the p-value is 0.05 or less. We can think of statistical significance as one factor in a larger decision-making process. It helps inform our decision regarding whether our findings are consistent with the status quo, which is what we're testing with these calculations, or whether there's something weird going on that may need to be investigated further. It should also be noted that the cutoff of 0.05 is a bit arbitrary, so just because a p-value ends up being something like 0.06 does not mean we should immediately dismiss the results, especially because you want to consider this in the context of other factors informing our decision-making process, such as the other literature available on the subject and the methodology of the study itself. There's a lot more that goes into the concept of statistical significance and p-values, but this will suffice for our purposes. For example, let's say it was the status quo for people to accept that where you lived, crime was a non-issue. However, one morning you saw a stabbing. I started to question this, but figured it could be a fluke. Maybe it was by someone visiting from out of town. Then one night you saw another stabbing, but then another night you saw another stabbing, and another night you saw 3 more. At what point do you consider it to be enough stabbings such that crime is a non-issue is no longer consistent with what you're observing? Well, you might arbitrarily draw the cutoff at something like 15. That doesn't mean that just because there's 14 stabbings and not 15 that we go, great, crime is a non-issue. It's similar with p-values and statistical significance. P-values are certainly informative, but it's not as rigid as anything above 0.05 means we don't have to listen to it, just like in the example. Anyway, as I was saying, there was a difference in all-cause mortality, it just wasn't statistically significant. It's also worth noting that the difference that was there favored vegans. What she also fails to mention is that her own source observed a statistically significant reduction in risk of incidence and/or mortality from ischemic heart disease and incidence of total cancer. And incidence here just refers to actual instances of those things happening. This again is reflected in the conclusion of the study, which states, this comprehensive meta-analysis reports a significant protective effect of a vegetarian diet versus the incidence and/or mortality from ischemic heart disease and incidence from total cancer. Vegan diets conferred a significant reduced risk of incidence from total cancer. Something else that is interesting about this paper is that two of the studies they cite, the EPIC Oxford study or Key 2009 and Oxford Vegetarian or Appleby 2002, didn't account for people who switched off of their vegetarian and vegan diets. My friend Matt noticed this and decided to run the numbers when you remove those two and instead used another study, Appleby 2016, that pooled their findings together and had a longer follow-up and adjusted for diet switchers. The result was that the p-value for the difference in ACM between vegetarians and omnivores went from 0.16 to 0.06. Another claim that Diana Rodgers makes is that cows convert arid lands into food. The study she cites for this is Mottet et al. According to them, if the yields were under 25% of the maximum estimated amount of crops able to be grown on that land, then it was considered unsuitable. In other words, if you estimated that a certain plot of land could grow X tons of apples, but in reality it only produced less than 25% of X tons, the land was considered unsuitable for apples. They did not apply the standard to cows. Further, as Avi points out, even if the cattle food yields are 40%, a 20% crop yield may still be more efficient given inherent trophic level losses of cattle. Basically, if we're feeding cows a ton of crops anyway, and they're converting it into less usable energy, a lot of calories goes into them, fewer calories comes out, then removing those cows frees up more available energy because now their feed could be directed towards human consumption, and we could, if needed, additionally grow plant foods on the lands where the cows used to be. Even if those plant foods only offer 20% of the maximum estimated yield, it's still a net increase in calories and available food because the cows are no longer requiring us to grow crops for them. Similarly, this model doesn't account for the fact that 20% of a high number is more impressive than 100% of a much smaller number. To take this to the extreme in order to make this point clear, if the maximum estimated amount of chickpeas that can be grown on a piece of land is 500 million tons, and the maximum estimated amount of beef that can be produced on that same amount of land is 10 tons, then 20% of 500 million, which is 100 million, will yield more food than 100% of 10 tons of beef. Perhaps the most explicit example, in my opinion anyway, of the disregard Diana Rodgers has for scientific integrity is her referencing the White and Hall study as evidence that animal agriculture isn't that bad for the environment. The main issue with this study is that in the model they developed, we would eliminate animals but keep producing their feed, which we would then feed to humans, and on top of that, we would grow even more grain in the areas where animals used to be, also to feed to humans, bringing our daily caloric intake to around 4,700 calories, mostly consuming grain or corn. But why did they do this? Well, the researchers were trying to construct a diet that, 1, made the fewest assumptions, 2, consists of only what we produce domestically. This means we wouldn't be importing things like fruits and vegetables, which they claim we don't have enough farmable land for. 3, is developed using a least cost optimization algorithm, which is notorious for producing diets that lack variety. 4, meets our nutritional requirements as closely as possible, hence why, under their model, we'd be eating so many calories. More calories equals more nutrition. And 5, offers only non-supplemental sources of nutrition. The issue with this, of course, is that this doesn't reflect reality at all. We can import things that we can't grow domestically. We can easily supplement things like B12 and DHA without driving our caloric intake up to almost 5,000 in an effort to get these things through food. Consequently, their model inflates the amount of greenhouse gas emissions that we would see under an applied plants-only system. This is because, under their model, we are producing such an obscene amount of crops that we would consequently have to grow, harvest, process, transport, and fertilize, and further, whose human inedible waste products we would have to dispose of. What I also find interesting is that even under this ridiculous model, agricultural greenhouse gas emissions in the US still decreased by 28%. The 2.6% figure that you often see come out of the study refers to national greenhouse gas emissions. As Dr. Carvalho points out in his own video on the topic, when this study came out, a number of papers were published criticizing it.
Now, maybe this sounds a bit too weird to be true. Maybe I'm presenting the study unfairly. How do you know you can trust me? Well, you don't need to. Several teams of scientists from different countries wrote to the editors of the journal expressing their concern about this study, and the journal published those letters. Here's one from European scientists, titled "Causing Confusion in the Debate about the Transition Toward a More Plant-Based Diet." It explains that in the study, nutrient deficiencies may have arisen from the unbalanced diet assumed in the plant-based scenario, with grains being 80% of daily consumption. Here's another letter from the US, titled "Without Animals, Farmers Would Reduce Feed Crop Production." Yeah, farmers would stop growing food for cows if there weren't any cows around. The titles of the letters almost tell the whole story. The authors of the study unrealistically assumed that without livestock, Americans would continue to grow animal feed and just incorporate it into human diets. Feed crops take up 75% of US cropland. Without livestock, all that land could be used to grow vegetables, biofuel crops, food for export, and provide critical habitat for native wildlife. By eliminating the need for animal feed, farmers could transition to a wider variety of grasses, grains, pulses, vegetables, and fruits that would be healthier for humans and the environment. Here's another letter by scientists from Harvard and Oxford called "Feedlot Diet for Americans." And then they added, "resulting from a misspecified optimization algorithm," because that's what we nerds sound like when we throw shade. The way the authors did the study is particularly nonsensical, as exemplified by their plant-based scenario. An energy intake twice that of an average adult, at almost 5,000 calories a day, with about 3,000 calories a day coming from corn. That's 24 ears of corn every day per person, and a half. And out of the 5,000 calories of food, over 4,000 calories from grains every day. More diverse diets, including vegetables, fruits, nuts, and seeds, legumes, would be possible. However, unfortunately, all the results in the study were based on implausible scenarios and therefore cannot represent realistic examples.
Dr. Zaldivar also claims that vegans will eventually develop deficiencies with respect to 13 certain nutrients, but my friend Danny's already addressed that in one of his videos.
Now, a couple things before we begin. This is a person who has their PhD, who doesn't read their sources properly, or at the very least reads them, but doesn't understand them.
She ends the video by alluding to the superfood qualities of red meat, and that would require a whole nother video to cover. If you guys are interested in that, feel free to let me know. As always, thank you for supporting what I do, and I hope to see you in the next video.